Hello there, everybody. If it's your first time with us today, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back to Chess with Nick. We're going to continue our Road to NM series with part 5 of the series here. And we're going to be looking at my experience in the Florida State Championships this year of 2021. And we're actually going to break this segment up into 4 different parts, try to give you a little bit shorter videos with each one so that we can cover the actions from all 6 rounds of this 4-day tournament. So this video, as we said, we're going to have 4 different videos for it. So there'll be a part 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, and 5.4 in our Road to NM series here. Each one will represent a different day of the tournament as we go through. So kicking things off, we're going to give you the round 1 action from the Florida State Championships. I played this year in the under 2100 section, haven't gotten over that threshold yet, so wanted to make sure that I could prove my mettle here before we dive back into the open section, taking on other IMs, GMs, these really high-rated players who right now, yes, I'd love to challenge them, I'd love to take them on, but not quite maybe there to hold my own against these guys just yet. So in the under 2100 section this year, in round 1, I got paired with Class A player Renato Dominguez. I was kicking things off with the white pieces, and in this game, and as we go through the different parts of the series, we're going to try to focus on some different themes, both psychological themes of what I'm thinking as we go through the tournament, but also just good chess themes, things that hopefully you can take away from these games and implement into your games as well. Now, in this game against Renato, the big theme that we're going to talk about as we look through the course of what happens here is the power of plans. And I'll be honest, this was not my best opening as we go through this game, and we'll see what I mean as we see things unfold. But the one thing that I was able to do was I was able to have more defined plans than my opponent, and we'll see how that causes the tide of the game to shift, and things change a little bit over the course of it. So let's go ahead, dive into the action, and let you figure out the rest as we go through, explain it all along the way. I decided to play the queen pawns opening in round 1, d4 and d5 from my opponent. I played the moves knight f3. Renato responded with c6, and now I made a move which is a little bit uncommon. This is not one of the more popular ways of going about the queen's pawns opening. A lot of times you might see things like c4 going into a Slav, maybe e3 keeping flexibility of a queen's gambit type position, maybe g3 in a Catalan, but I played the move knight to c3. And knight to c3 is a move that seems maybe a little bit incorrect to a lot of people. You say, we're moving this knight, and now you're in front of your c-pawn where it's not going to be able to push. But the idea behind this move is actually we're going to get a little bit of control over e4 very quickly in the game, and my plan is going to be to try to push for this e4 square the first chance I get. Also, because black hasn't pushed this e-pawn yet, he can't immediately come out and pin my knight to the king, so it takes him a little bit of time to create that pressure. Bishop f5 was played by Renato, and of course he is putting pressure on that e4 square, so I can't immediately make that break. I decided to play with the move e3, and once again e3 is aimed at the idea of bringing my bishop quickly out to the d3 square to try to control e4. Of course, downsides of this, the c1 bishop doesn't look very happy anymore. Where's he going? He's suddenly locked in behind his own section of pawns. So this is a sort of move that maybe looks a little bit passive from white. It does have some ideas behind it, and it does keep a lot of solidity, so there's nothing objectively wrong, but it's maybe not the most aggressive way for white to play. e6 from Renato, and now bishop to d3, just like we talked about, coming out, immediately contesting for the center of the board, and offering this trade of bishops as well. Renato played the move knight to d7. He was a little bit concerned about potentially me diving my own knight to the e5 square. He wanted to make sure he got a little bit of control over that square. And here, already we kind of talked about what my idea was, and this was where I missed the perfect chance to just go ahead and play it right away. I should have played the move e4, right? This was my idea behind my opening play, behind knight c3 and bishop d3. And we're talking about plans being our theme here, and when you have a plan, you want to follow through with it, you want to stick to it, and this was the first mistake that I made in the game, and a reason why I suddenly start to get a little bit behind in the opening. After the moves d takes e4 and knight takes e4, we certainly have a very playable position. It looks a lot like a Caro-Kann type structure now. We've simply transposed into that sort of opening, and moves like knight g3 can be coming, castling to the king side, or maybe even developing this bishop. Maybe I'll go queenside, who knows? But it's a nice, normal-looking opening in this sort of Caro type structure. However, I did not play the move e4 here. I decided to wait off a move, and I castled first. And the problem with castling first, of course, was that this gave black the option of getting more control over the e4 square. So knight g develops very naturally, and now black has 3 pieces attacking this e4 square, and it's not going to be as easy for me to get control of it. Of course, I can play rook e1 right now, but he can immediately plop this knight onto the e4 square. So I made a move which was definitely inaccurate in the position, and this started to give me a back footing as we went throughout. I played the move knight to e2, and my idea with knight e2 is, okay, this knight really isn't great on c3, so I'm going to reroute it to g3, put some pressure on your bishop. It'll fight for e4 from over there, and I'll see if I can untangle this way. However, drawbacks again, I've already moved that knight twice. Not a good thing generally to do in the opening when you're still working on developing. My bishop on c1 is still looking pretty ugly. And my whole plan of playing for e4, well, I just moved a piece away from the control of that square. Yeah, I'll bring it to somewhere else where it's going to help with that, but I'm still going to need to bring more firepower to bear on e4 if I want to make that push. So this was not a good move to do that if I really wanted to go all out on e4. Remember, when you have a plan, you tend to want to stick with it. A better way of doing that would have been to play the move knight to d2. And knight to d2 suddenly puts all of my pieces aiming at this e4 square. If I even need to, I could play the move f3 to prepare it as well in that manner. So the wrong knight move here for the plan. I played knight e2 instead of knight d2. Either way, they're both kind of awkward moves, moving knight twice in the opening. I don't love already what I've done with the white pieces, and let's see how black is able to build on that a little bit over the next couple moves. Black plays the move bishop to d6. Of course, I bring my knight out to g3, where it was headed to, putting pressure on this f5 bishop. And Renato did a very good job throughout this game of maintaining the tension. He never dove too early into looking to trade off the pieces. He plays the very calm move bishop to g6. Of course, if he plays bishop takes d3, I can recapture with the queen, or maybe even with the c-pawn, and that would make it even easier to achieve that e4 break. So lots of options if he does trade off the pieces there. Well, now I played rook e1. Again, I want to play e4 if I get the chance, but Renato made sure I did not get that chance and played knight e4 himself first. And now comes a very big sort of moment for white. You'll notice what black has done with this setup here is this is a reverse London system that black is playing. He developed his bishop out to f5. He put his knights on their natural squares. He has this very solid structure, e6, c6, and d5. And these are all common plans that you see white use a lot of times in the London system, a very sound setup. And because I've taken a couple moves here, danced my knight all around the board, really black is playing a London very similar to what white would have as a London, and he even has the same sort of tempo because I've wasted a couple moves with my knight. So I already feel like I've given away my edge with the white pieces, and this knight is now at a very happy square. Black could even consider playing f5, though it does make the bishop pretty ugly looking. So he definitely has ways of solidifying this knight. Now, one thing I could do at this point is simply push the pawn, play for the c4 break, try to get some queenside space. I've already brought my knight to the king side, so black will get some play on the king side, but I've got defenders over there. It's not going to be so easy to break through, and I could try to gain some space in the other areas and look to unwind and trade off at the right times. I decided that instead of doing that, I wanted to make black make an immediate decision. So I played the move bishop takes e4. And my point behind this move is that it forces black to choose between one of two things. If black plays the move bishop takes e4, well, this would simply allow me to trade everything off if I want. I can take the knight, he can take the pawn, and black has a little bit of an awkward structure. His bishop is certainly better than my bishop on c1, but he has these doubled pawns on the e-file, and after my knight moves to d2, there's immediate pressure on the e4 square. The queen can come into the game on the light squares, and white is going to be able to unwind from this position, maybe even play f3 and e4 at some point as well. So this would have been a nice way for me to unwind if he takes with the bishop. So instead, Renato took with the pawn, and my point in this position is that now that you've taken with the pawn, this bishop on g6 no longer looks so great. So I dance my knight back to d2, and I simply say, okay, I traded off my bishop for your knight, which was a nice knight on e4, and now what is your bishop doing on g6? It's sort of stuck behind its own pawn here that's on e4. So this is the idea behind my play, trying to show that, okay, I haven't been the most accurate so far with my opening, but I'm not going to let you get great pieces either. I'm going to try to work against your pieces. Here, black missed a chance to really take over the initiative. Black could have played the move queen to h4, a nice way to defend this e4 pawn and get really active very quickly, but instead Renato played the move knight to f6, and black's position is perfectly fine, don't get me wrong, but the problem with knight to f6 is where are these pieces going? This knight is suddenly in front of the f-pawn, so I don't have to worry about f5 and f4 ideas for the moment or the time being. This knight can't come to g4 because my queen controls it. Neither the knight nor the bishop can come to h5 because my knight and my queen are contesting those squares. So both of these pieces are now out on the king side where they look active, but what is their plan? What is black trying to make happen? Now again, we've talked about earlier, my plan for white was I really want to try to get control over this square. I need to unwind my pieces, try to fight for the center in some way. And here I made a move that's maybe very questionable to do in this position, but definitely a dynamic move that forced black to do something, and that was the move f3. Again, earlier in the game, I should have played e4 when I had the chance. Now, you suddenly see that white is really trying to do everything in their power to force this e4 move in. I was very stuck to my idea of a plan. And yes, sometimes you do want to stick to your plans, but sometimes you got to be a little flexible and change things up as well. This move might have been a little too forcing, and sometimes forcing the issue can lead to some big weaknesses. And of course you look at this and you say, well, doesn't this really weaken white's structure? What if black plays the move bishop takes g3? Well, of course, this will lead to a little weakening of the structure. White will have to play the move h takes g3. But my point here was simply that, you know what I'm going to do defensively? If you play a move like queen to c7, I'm actually going to step my king up to the f2 square, where it helps to secure all three of these pawns, and maybe you'll be able to get some counterplay on the h-file. Black could try h5 and h4, but now that the h-file's open, I can put my own rook over here, and I can contest this h-file. I'll be able to fight for everything that's opening up on the queen side, and it's going to be a lot more difficult for black to break through on this king side, even though things maybe have been loosened up a little bit. I've sort of stepped everything up a rank, but it's not so easy for black to really demonstrate a good breakthrough after white plops the rook over to h1. Maybe the center trades off, maybe the center closes, and we figure out where we're going to place our knight. The main problem for white here is the simple fact that the c1 bishop is really bad. If white can solve the problem of the c1 bishop, he'll be able to hold in this sort of structure. If not, then black's definitely got more to play with because his pieces are going to be much more happy attacking the white king. Well, my opponent didn't play bishop takes g3. He decided to play another way to build the pressure first rather than taking immediately, and he played the move queen to c7. And again, this could transpose into what we looked at before. I could play the move king to f2 here, but if I play king to f2, well, we'll get the same position that we just looked at, but I have another option. And that's simply to close up the position. Because black doesn't take immediately, doesn't take my knight, and doesn't take my pawn, now I have the option of playing f4. And suddenly, this whole idea of, right, I was fighting for e4, I was trying to undermine that, I was putting everything toward making that happen, we're throwing that out the window, we're changing the structure of the position, and this is a very important psychological moment in chess. A lot of times when you're worse, or if you don't really like what's going on, you've been trying to maybe force something to happen, you're not being able to make it, sometimes being able to make a structural change, like this move f4, which essentially takes the position from being potentially very open to totally closed, is a good way to put pressure on your opponent mentally. And the reason I say that is all of the ideas, everything we've been thinking of up until this moment has been revolving around tactics with taking. Am I going to take toward the center with the knight, with the queen? How are things going to open up? Where are these pieces going to go when these lines open up and everything starts flying open? Well, once we close the position, suddenly all of that thought process, everything we've been focused on, goes totally out the window. And now, again, we have to take a step back, reassess the position, and come up with completely new ideas and new plans. So what is black's plan here? Well, black decides to go for a kingside attack. He plays the move h5, and this is a very aggressive move, one that I had looked at before playing the move f4, and it's sort of expected. He's coming to h4, looking to attack this knight, and then he'll free up this h5 square for his pieces. But again, with the structure closed, it's still not so easy to guarantee you're going to open up lines for this rook. White can always push pawns h3 or g3 as this pawn comes up the board and keep the structure locked up together. So after h5, I decided to play the move knight to c4. And the point behind this move is simply that, hey, if you run forward with h4 right away, I'm going to go ahead and trade off your bishop before moving my knight away. And even though, yes, it doesn't look like this bishop's doing very much right now, there's potential for that bishop to really be a thorn in my side if black can manage to achieve moves like g5 at some point. Like, let's say this bishop comes to h5, black plays the move g5, trying to tear open the king side, then this battery becomes very dangerous. So I'm trying to get this knight out of the way, trade it off for a potentially dangerous piece down the line. And also, after the move h4, well, my g3 knight is going to have to retreat. So if my knight goes back to f1, then the knight on d2, they're going to be stepping on each other, and neither knight will have good places to go. So the other part of this decision is simply, you know what? This knight isn't going to have anywhere to go if this knight is in the way, so we'll get rid of this one, get rid of a potentially dangerous piece in the process. After queen takes d6, now we can play the move knight to f1. And again, I'm not saying that white is out of the dark yet, because things look pretty scary looking here, and I really like black's position. Look at white's pieces. This knight is on f1. It's stuck behind all of his own pieces, nowhere to go other than d2. However, it does do a good defensive job. It holds a lot of squares, makes it very hard for the black pieces to get into the game. Now, white's bishop rather on c1 is also terrible. I mean, where is it going? It can't get out of here. It's going to take at least 2 moves to go anywhere. So black's bishop is bad, his knight is bad, his a1 rook is bad, it's stuck behind the bishop. The e1 rook, well, it's a little bit closer to defending, but even that isn't doing much. It's just stuck defending its own pawn. And the queen isn't doing anything active either. None of white's pieces even a single black target. All of white's pieces are on the first rank in defensive places, not where you want them to be. Now, that being said, my opponent decided to castle queenside here, and this was another inaccuracy from Renato. Much better in the previous position, and what I was anticipating seeing was the move bishop to h5. Looking to gain tempo by attacking this queen, and after the queen comes to d2, now black can get ready for moves like g5 at the right time. Maybe he can play knight g4 at some point, Maybe now he could play h3 and try to create some light squared weaknesses. It's not so easy to make a decisive breakthrough, but I felt that by playing bishop h5, he's going to clear some space for the g-file to be able to be used. Maybe he can even just play rook h6 to g6 like this in order to come into the game. That looks pretty nice. And I felt that this was a good tempo-gaining move, getting the piece out of the way in order to continue a clear plan of attack on the king side. Now, castling to the queen side, it does continue with that idea. He's trying to connect his rooks. He likely wants to bring this one over to the g-file and then try to do the same sort of ideas. But the problem is that he's not going to get as much time this way. And also, now Renato has committed his king to the queen side. And here's where we really want to start talking about the power of plans in this game. Over the next several moves, White has very clear plans. He has a very clear decision of what am I going to do, how do I need to get my pieces activated, what steps am I going to have to take to accomplish this. And Black sort of fumbles about and figuring out the best way to go about the attack. At this moment, Black is undoubtedly better. I do not like my position with the white pieces. I'm not happy at all. I'm only slightly consoled by the fact that I don't see a decisive breakthrough. I don't see decisive forcing moves by Black, but that doesn't make me feel better about the position as a whole. Just to know that I'm not immediately losing is, at least nice in that regard. However, after castles queenside, my plan is very simple. These pawns need to come up the board. They all need to start attacking and going after this black king. I want to open up lines on the king side with moves like b5. I want to get my bishop out to a3 or b2 at the right moment, bring my rooks over here, and just go all out on the queen side with basically these four pieces and my pawns trying to get an attack. The reason I can do this is because Black's ideas aren't very fast. Even though my pieces are bad, Black's are only slightly better. They're not doing a whole lot. This knight doesn't have great places to go. It can't come to g4 or e4. Yes, the bishop can come to h5, but then what is it really doing from there after the queen moves? The rook is still behind its own pawns. It's going to take multiple moves for Black to organize. And while he gets organized, my hope is that I'll be able to get my counterplay going equally as quick. So the first move I played here is c3. And again, you might say, why c3 and not c4 if you're going all out on the queen side? Well, the reason behind this was I was a little bit worried about Black playing the move c5. So if I play c4 right away, Black can actually respond with c5 here, and suddenly not only does he have this sort of kingside attack going, but he's also really starting to undermine White's center. This pawn can't capture on c5 because of the pin. My queen would be attacked twice, and he's threatening to take 3 times on d5 as well and win a pawn. So I would have to be very careful here with White, and I don't really like what White will have to do to try to hold this. Everything looks bad. It looks like my center is falling in addition to my king, which doesn't look very happy over here at the moment either. So I don't want to allow this. So c3 is a move to secure this square. If you play c5, I simply don't have to worry about it now, because if you take, I'll take with the c-pawn and say thank you very much for the open c-file. So that's the idea behind c3. Also, it does prepare the move b4 and allow my queen to come into the game. So multiple uses from that move. And like we mentioned before, I'm starting to formulate my plans. I'm starting to get organized with what I'm going to do. We know I want to go for this queenside attack. And Black takes a move to secure things here. He plays the move king to b8. And I do believe it's a good idea to keep things secure. This is not a bad move by any means. But Black also is not moving any closer to his aggressive ideas yet. So if Black isn't moving closer to his ideas, well, let's keep going with ours. a4, going forward with the position. Now, once again, what's Black's best response? I still believe that he should be looking to make space, get this bishop in, try to get these pawns going forward. And here, these next couple moves, just sort of show that black doesn't quite have a clear idea of what he wants to do. Renato played the move queen to d5, and he's trying to make this queen a little bit better, maybe trying to swing it into the king side via moves like king to f5 and entering on the light squares. h3 would provoke g3 and create a lot of light squared weaknesses in the white position, but there's not a decisive breakthrough in there. Even if black manages to, let's say, put a pawn on h3 and this bishop gets all the way to g2 and this knight comes into g4 and the queen even gets into f3, this all looks very scary, but even then, there's no good way to actually break through the black stronghold on these squares. Black has such strong control over the dark squares, and the only thing he has to worry about is if this queen is able to get to f3, then he needs to make sure his own queen can come to f2 and trade off. If white can trade the queens off, there's really not going to be any big aggressive attack that black can get without also opening up these g-files for the rooks. Then things get a little bit dicey. So still stuff to worry about, but if white can keep things closed, keep blockades on the dark squares, and trade off at the right timely manner, there's not really good mating threats that black can create. So here queen to c2. And queen to c2 is a dual purpose move. For one, we move away from bishop h5 ideas, which would come with tempo. For two, we put our queen on the second, where it's very flexible and potentially helping to defend things in the events of pawn pushes or anything opening up on the king side. And four, or three rather, we prepare the move c3, gaining time, or c4 rather, c3, c4, attacking black's queen, gaining time in our attack against the king side. So this is a nice multi-purpose move, and now let's see what Renato does to react. And once again, I think another imprecise move here. He played the move rook to h5. I really think this bishop needed to clear the way, and the move g5 needed to happen as soon as possible. I don't think that lifting the rook actually helps at all to open things up on this king side. I think the g-pawn is the key lever that needs to be pushed forward. Renato's thinking here is, you know what, I'm going to lift this rook into the game. Maybe it'll be able to get to the g-file after the bishop comes back to h7, and I play g5. And also maybe from the 5th rank, it might swing over to defend against some attacks against my king as white's pawns get going. That was sort of his thinking here, but it's a little bit imprecise, and I think after rook h5, suddenly white's counterplay is going to start coming fast enough that we're getting very close to dynamic equality here. White is almost out of the cellar and back into the game at this point. And c4 continues very straightforward. Remember, white has a plan, white's continuing with it, and black is sort of floundering a bit. He's made a few moves that haven't accomplished very much. King b8, queen d5, rook h5, and now queen to f5. All our moves which, yeah, his pieces are on new squares, but are they doing that much more there? I mean, now this knight can't go to h5. The bishop is stuck behind other pieces. His own pieces are becoming worse with where he's put his major pieces. So I am starting to like my position with white. I don't feel black has accomplished very much. And after the move b4, well, suddenly white's attack is coming. Even though black had this pawn already in the white side of the board and looked like he was getting ready to create threats, this wall, this storm of pawns is right here, ready to break through into the position and stir up some trouble. And suddenly, now I sort of like my side of things. Now I'm suddenly beginning to like the white pieces, and let's see how the attack evolves. Well, bishop h7 from Renato. He's finally starting to be able to play g5, but now he's just behind on time. b5 is coming crashing into the position, and Renato has to be very careful that he doesn't let me open up all these lines against the king. If I play b takes c6, things look very dangerous for that black king. c5 is played instead, and, well, I may not be able to open the b file yet, but I can open up the d file. And yes, that does open up Renato's rook, but my point is that after queen takes c5, guess which piece is coming into the game? Here comes the bishop. Bishop to a3, and suddenly that c1 bishop that was our worst piece for 15 moves for the first entire part of the game, suddenly this bishop is now white's best piece. His pawns are all on light squares. The bishop has great life on the diagonal. It could even come back to the big diagonal over here, and look at all of these squares that bishop can come to and control. Very, very different look for this bishop suddenly. Black played the move queen to c7, and now I missed a very nice chance to take over the game. I overlooked one idea from black. I still like the way that my position unfolded, but I chose the wrong rook to go about business. I played the move rook a to d1, contesting the d file. And part of my point here is if you trade, things are not good. If you play rook takes d1 and rook takes d1, now I own the d file. I'm threatening bishop to e6, skewering your queen to your king and pinning it and just having a happy day. c5 looks like it's coming as well. Sure, my knight on f1 isn't great, but I have 3 attacking pieces, and you have 3 pieces that aren't doing very much to help out at all at the moment. So I would be very happy with this position. What did I overlook, however? What's wrong with rook a d1? Well, the move I overlooked was rook to d3. And quite simply, the point here is if you take the rook, then black takes it back, and don't forget about this h7 bishop. It anchors this pawn on d3, and white suddenly has to worry about a very pesky passed pawn as a bone in his throat. So I did not want to trade off rooks and give black this passed pawn to play with. And if we go back a move, we will notice how it'd be much different if I played the e-rook to d1. This would be much nicer for white because now after rook d3, even though things are similar, there's one more very simple point, and that's that the rook does not gain a tempo on my a3 bishop because my rook on the a file still defends it. And this would allow white to continue with a move like c5, which he really wants to play in this position, gain the space, and keep the pressure up. Let's go back to what the game position is. Rook a instead. Well, now after rook d3, I have to do something about my bishop. Bishop to b2, not the end of the world, because even though it's a defensive retreating move, we are still moving with a threat. Bishop e5 would, of course, win the exchange, because black would have to give up the rook for the bishop to not lose the queen. But the problem now is this c5 push is going to be much more difficult to achieve, because the queen and the rook are both covering this square. However, well, even though I made a mistake, my opponent was not at the top of his game either, and I will say that this was the first round we were both trying to knock off a little bit of rust, and the game did start at 7:30, so as the hours wore on, already by move 25, we were about 10 o'clock at night, played about 2.5 hours, even by this point of the game, and fatigue starts to set in a little bit here. And what my opponent really needs to do is reroute this knight, play a move like knight to d7, and shore up control over c5. Instead, my opponent plays the move queen to a5, and unfortunately, queen to a5 really justifies me moving my other rook. Basically says, you know what? I'm not going to even show that that was a mistake. You can keep going about your plans because now white is able to play c5, and I'm also able to play another move first, which is bishop to e5. Bishop e5 check, and I'm making a very simple question. What are you going to do with this king? There's really 3 options. The first 2 are moving the king. You could come to the a8 square, which does not look good because then your king is going to have to worry about a lot of back rank problems. You could come to the c8 square. Also does not look good because now your king is going to have to worry about the c-pawn coming up the board and blowing up the position right on top of the king. And the last thing to do would be to trade the rook for the bishop, give up the exchange, but even this doesn't look so great. Not only are you going to be giving up an exchange, but what's really black's compensation here for the piece? After a move like knight to g4, white is still defending the e-pawn twice. It's true he might want to do something about the e5 pawn, but he can also just continue with his counterplay with a move like c5, and even if you take this guy over here, well, the pawns are coming up the board, and white is getting a very fast attack after c6. So yes, black can get a knight or get an exchange and a pawn in exchange for that bishop, but it doesn't really look so great here. Everything is opening up. These rooks are going to be able to help out, and white is able to keep the initiative. So not only would black have to sacrifice material, he also doesn't really get a whole lot back in exchange for it if he goes that way. So my opponent played king to c8. Once again, none of these options are pretty. You've got to choose one. And of course, what are we going to do? Continue with our plan. Very straightforward for white, c5. Once again, for the last about 10 moves or so, white's had a very clear-cut plan. Attack on the queen side, keep pushing pawns, put the pieces on the right squares, and black is playing move by move, trying to survive. And you can see how when you're taking things move by move, when you don't have a clear-cut plan, things can start to slip away from you a little bit. So we always want to make sure we're thinking in these schemes, looking for bigger pictures, because if we try to find the best move every single move, it's very, very difficult to do. I mean, if you can do that, awesome. You're going to win every game if you always play the best move every move. But the human side of things says, hey, we need to actually be thinking in multi-move ideas. Knight e8 is played by black. He's trying to kick my bishop back out, and I decided to play the move b6, looking to open things up by fixing this pawn on b7 before making the c6 push. My opponent played f6. I brought the bishop back to d4, putting a second defender on the c4 or the c5 square. Of course, my opponent then played e5, but my point here is after f takes e5, f takes e5, now this pawn is in the way of your rook from being able to attack the c-pawn, and my bishop can drop back to a1. I don't have to worry about you capturing my c-pawn. The bishop still puts pressure on the e5 square, and by going to a1, I leave both the b and c files as open options for my rooks to swing over to join in the attack. My opponent played rook to h6. He really does not want to allow this c6 push. If this c6 push happens, everything is opening up, and the attack is next to unstoppable. I played b takes a7 here. This guarantees the b file will be open to attack. Also creates some little cheeky tactical ideas of queening at the right moment if my opponent doesn't take the pawn. So my opponent took the pawn, doesn't want to have to deal with that. And now, well, what was the downside to rook h6? No more defense on the e5 pawn. Bishop takes e5, and at this point, finally, I think we can say white is winning. Not just better, but winning. He's up a pawn, and I'm still threatening to open up the position. My pieces are starting to get a little more coordinated. I still want to improve them. They're not there yet, but look at black's pieces. They are all over the map, not working together well at all. And yes, white still has two passive pieces on e1 and f1, but everything is a lot more working together. Everything is starting to eye the critical squares around black's king. Rook to c6, trying to stop any breakthroughs. Bishop comes back to d4, defending the pawn and sort of trapping this d3 rook, saying, what's your rook suddenly doing here on d3? Yes, it's anchored, but now that it's there, what are you going to do with it? Knight to f6, trying to bring the knight back into the game, also making sure that I can't capture on g7 if he moves the knight to another square like c7. Rook to b1, and of course now I'm just going to continue with very simple plans. Play on the queen side, improve all my pieces, and eventually find a breakthrough. So even though I've already taken a pawn, even though we push some pawns, open up some lines, now's not the time to rush. We still want to make a few calm moves, get all of our pieces to their best squares, and once our pieces are on the best squares, then we'll make the decisive break. Queen to a5 was played by black, another little bit of an inaccuracy, and his point is he's pressuring my e1 rook, so I can't lift this rook right away without losing my e1 rook. But the problem is, I'm just going to move this rook to the side. And rook e to c1 may seem like a little bit of a waste, but the point is that I'm just going to play rook b5 now and say your queen on a5 is silly. It has nowhere forward to go, and you're going to have to move it back. So even if rook e to c1 loses a tempo, queen to a5 also loses a tempo. So they wash each other out, and still I'm the one moving closer to my goals because after this rook lifts, then my other rook can double, and I'm moving closer to my goals, and what has black really accomplished? So I don't really like the move queen a5 because of that. Bishop g8, black's trying to reroute this bishop, trying to get his pieces desperately back into the game. Well, what are we going to do? We already said the plan. Rook to b5. Drive the queen backwards, say, why did you make that move? I don't really see a good point behind it. Queen comes back to a6, and now rook c to b1. It took our e-rook 2 moves to get there, but this queen isn't any better on a6 than on a7. We've got all the pressure on the b file. Maybe we'll even take on b7 at the right moment. Maybe we'll slide our queen over to b2 and put pressure on the diagonal and the file and just all over the black position. Rook to c7 was played, and this was the final mistake in the game. I don't know that black could have defended from the previous position to begin with. His idea behind rook c7 is he doesn't want me to take the b7 pawn. He's a little bit worried about that, but I think that's the least of his worries here because after rook to b6, attacking the queen again, we're putting more pressure on the knight, and also, more importantly, after queen to a5, we've opened up space for our final decisive break, c6. And now there is nothing that black can do to stop the position from totally collapsing. At this point, my opponent was lower on time, partially because, once again, remember, I had plans that were very clear, very straightforward, and I had about a 30-minute time advantage over my opponent at this point. Out of the opening, that wasn't the case, but after I started playing for the queenside attack, and as my opponent sort of floundered around, we started to see that gap grow and grow, and again, that's the advantage of having those clear plans. So have clear plans for where to put your pieces, and you'll see these decisive results happen in the long run. In this position, my opponent actually flagged. This was the end of the game, but I do want to demonstrate that there's really no good move here for black. So first of all, let's look at the two capture options and show how neither of those moves work. If black plays the move b takes c6, well, there's a simple tactic for white to win a piece here. Take the knight on f6. After black recaptures, now rook to b8. And suddenly the king is skewered and the g8 bishop will fall. So that will lose a piece for black. He cannot play b takes c6. So what about rook takes c6? Well, rook takes c6 is just going to let white crash into the position. Rook takes c6 with check, b takes c6, and queen takes c6, and this is just horrendous looking. One very simple way, let's say black plays queen to c7, now simply queen to a8, and if the king moves up, you can play rook b7, skewering the queen to the king, still have threats of taking the knight and taking the bishop as well. No good moves here for black, so he can't take the c6 pawn with the rook, he can't take the c6 pawn with the pawn, and if you can't take the c6 pawn, well, I don't think that there are any good moves left for you. You could try moving one of your other pieces, but the point is white is going to be able to take this pawn on b7 with check, then take the rook, and then queen the pawn. So let's go ahead and make an example move just to show it. Let's say you play a move like bishop to d5 here, trying to force white's hand. Well, c takes b7 with check, king gets in front of the pawn, and now the queen sacrifice breaking through. Queen takes c7, king has to take, and now we make another queen. We've won the rook and the pawn, and we're still checking, and the pieces are flooding into black's position, and white's king is perfectly safe with this knight over here and no good counterplay from black. So even though my opponent flagged, it was a very hopeless position in which he did. And this was the start of the Florida State Championship. So I was able to survive round one, come out with a win in spite of being much worse out of the opening. And once again, what's the real key takeaway from this game? Well, one, study your openings. Of course, you don't want to get behind like I did, have to dig yourself out of the hole. But more importantly, always look for plans in those middle games. The reason I was able to come back, really turn this game around, was because I had very clear plans, knew where I wanted to put my pieces, made those things happen, and my opponent was not able to visualize the best squares for his pieces. He wasn't able to make things happen in a timely manner. So keep your plans going, always think about where those pieces belong, and soon you'll be having a lot of positive, decisive results as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed this first video, and look forward to seeing you back and seeing you what you do in your games to come. Best of luck. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, post any comments, and share via the buttons below. Check out our website at chesswithnick.com for further video, more content, and any postings on lessons, further video analysis, or written analysis that you may be interested in. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Chess with Nick, on youtube.com. Have a great day, and wishing you best of luck.